June 12, 1944. Aboard the USS General Hugh Gaffey, bound for California, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura squinted at the horizon. Behind him, the Pacific. Ahead, America. Beside him, another officer leaned over and laughed. "Texas," he said in Japanese. "Cowboys with toy pistols." Nakamura smirked. "I wonder if they'll lasso us in the prison yard," he replied. The men chuckled. Even now, after capture, they clung to pride. To the Japanese elite, America was a nation of mechanics, gamblers, and chewing gum drifters. A culture of chaos. A people without soul. And cowboys? They were the punchline. Real warriors wore white gloves, bowed to the emperor, died with dignity in their cockpit. Americans rode bulls and danced. As the ship creaked forward, Nakamura closed his eyes. In his mind, he replayed the last radio dispatch from Saipan, a scream cut short, a fireball in the sky. He hadn't surrendered. His zero had failed. The Americans just picked him up, smiling. 2 months later, he'd be standing in Texas, boots covered in dust, hat shading his eyes, staring at a boy in cowboy boots, quoting Ralph Waldo Emerson. He laughed at cowboys, but he hadn't seen what cowboys could build. The sun over Saipan burned like judgment. By June 1944, the island had become a furnace of steel and screams. The air reeked of gunpowder and rot. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, was collapsing inward. Battleships torn open, pilots never returning. Radio messages clipped mid-sentence, replaced by static or silence. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura had flown 4 zero missions in 10 days. On the 11th, his engine sputtered. A lone shell tore through his wing. Fuel burst like fireworks. A cloud of black oil blinded him. He crash-landed in sugarcane, smoke pouring through the canopy. Delirious, half-conscious, he reached for the pistol tucked in his boot. But a dozen American rifles were already waiting. They didn't shoot. They gave him water. He expected interrogation, torture, maybe slow starvation in some jungle cell. Instead, a medical tent. Bandaged ribs, morphine. A translator who said nothing threatening, only, "You're not dead. You're in custody." 2 weeks later, wrists bound with cotton rope, Nakamura boarded a transport ship out of Pearl Harbor. His body bruised, uniform torn, but his resolve untouched. He believed in the soul of Japan. The Americans, for all their noise, were morally bankrupt. Sloppy, drowning in their own abundance. On the deck at night, he and the other captured officers whispered about Yamato's ghosts, about honor, about how Japan would rise again. They called America a paper machine. "They wear sunglasses and drink sugar water," Nakamura said. "We carry swords and bury our names in battle." When the ship docked in California, he expected to see cages, dogs, clubs. What he saw was stranger. Neat rows of buses, freshly painted olive drab. Windows clean. Drivers in tidy khaki uniforms, who nodded, said nothing, and opened the doors. As Nakamura stepped aboard, a military officer handed him a boxed lunch, as if he were a guest on a school trip. Inside, roast beef on rye, a boiled egg, a perfect red apple, and a small chilled metal can. The label read, "Coca-Cola." He turned it over like it was a riddle. He cracked it open with suspicion. The first sip made his mouth twitch, sharp, sweet, cold. He drank the whole thing. By the third day, the buses rolled into Hereford, Texas. The heat came from the earth itself, dry, ancient, blowing red dust across endless plains. It was another planet. The camp didn't look like a prison. Low wire fences, wooden towers, yes, but guards leaned in the shade, not gripping rifles. Rows of pine barracks, a chapel, a vegetable garden, a radio tower blinking at the sky. The sign above the entrance read, Camp Hereford, U.S. Army POW Facility. No skulls, no slogans, just a metal plaque, almost polite. As Nakamura stepped down, the first thing he heard was laughter. A group of German prisoners sat under a pecan tree, playing chess. One waved at him and called out in accented English, "Welcome to cowboy country." Nakamura looked to the guard. Nothing, no punishment. Just a nod toward the line for processing. He moved forward silently, scanning the surroundings for signs of the real America, the brutal one he'd been trained to expect. But all he saw were oil silos in the distance, tractors, and boys in cowboy hats. Yes, cowboys. Some wore boots polished to a shine. Others leaned on the fence rails, twirling chewing gum between their fingers. One, no older than 17, tipped his hat and said, "Afternoon, sir," as if they were neighbors, not enemies. That night, Nakamura was assigned to Barracks 14C. The mattress felt too soft. The sheets smelled of detergent. On the pillow, a slip of paper read, "Laundry Tuesdays." At 1900 hours, a loudspeaker crackled to life. Music drifted out, twangy strings, a slow voice singing about buffalo and stars. Home on the range. He lay there stiff, fists clenched beneath the blanket. "This is a circus," he muttered. But the silence that followed was deeper than doubt. He had seen Americans swarm the Pacific with flame tanks and bulldozers, ships that stitched themselves back together in days, planes refueled like taxis. But here, in this strange land of wind and barbed wire, was something more dangerous. Not rage, not vengeance, just calm. He turned his face toward the window, where the stars hung clear over the desert sky, and thought for the first time. What if they aren't fools? What if they're builders? The wind in Hereford never stopped. It howled across the camp's open fields, dragging dust into the corners of every barrack, rattling loose screen doors, whistling through gaps in the window frames. It carried the smell of hay, and something else, cattle. One morning, Nakamura stepped outside and caught sight of a herd far beyond the fence line. Dozens of longhorns moving in slow rhythm, their flanks shimmering in the heat. The sound of boots behind him. A guard, young, sunburned, unbothered, chewing a toothpick. "You ever work a ranch?" he asked like it was small talk. Nakamura didn't answer. The boy smiled. "You will." The next week, Nakamura's name was listed for an agricultural labor detail. Not punishment, assignment. He was handed gloves, boots, and a sack lunch. A military truck drove him and 5 others through the flatland until the camp disappeared behind them. Out here, the sun was cruel, and the air smelled like dry roots and diesel. They arrived at a ranch, fencing worn, barn open, an old windmill creaking in the distance. A farmer, maybe in his 60s, waved them over. He wore denim overalls, a straw hat, and a revolver on his hip. Nakamura tensed. But the man's first words were simple. "Y'all thirsty?" He handed out tin cups, water with lemon, ice. The next hours passed in heat and silence. They hauled hay, oiled fences, shoveled feed. American guards watched from the truck, but not a single gun was drawn. At lunch, they sat beneath an elm tree. The farmer passed around sandwiches. No threats, no lectures. Then, the farmer's son arrived. Thin, pale, freckles under his hat. 19 at most. He wore dusty boots and a belt buckle the size of a soup can. He shook Nakamura's hand like a politician. "Name's Eli," he said. "Texas A&M, aerospace engineering." Nakamura blinked. "Engineering?" Eli grinned. "I'm just helping Pa this summer. But when I graduate, I'm going to build bombers, real fast ones, with fuel lines like arteries." The words cut deeper than intended. The boy, who dressed like a stage performer, was planning engines while sweating in a pasture. The American stereotype Nakamura had mocked was studying wing dynamics and load balance. The contradiction gnawed at him. Later, on the ride back, Nakamura stared out at the horizon. It looked empty, but he knew now under that soil were pipelines. In those barns were spare parts, and in every smiling face, some quiet intention. That evening, as the sun melted over the plains, a German POW leaned against the fence, cigarette between his fingers. "You know," the man said in crisp, bored English, "I used to think the same as you." Nakamura didn't reply. The German exhaled. "They treat war like a business. It's disgusting, but effective." Then he flicked the cigarette over the fence and walked away. Nakamura didn't sleep much that night. Rain never lasted long in Hereford. One morning, a thin gray sheet swept across the plains and vanished before noon. The earth hissed, the dust returned. But in that short window, the road outside camp turned to muck. Nakamura's work detail was delayed. The truck couldn't pass. He stood in line for hot water and black coffee like the others, staring at the bulletin board near the mess hall. A new notice: library hours expanded. A library for prisoners. That afternoon, curiosity nudged him through its door. A converted barrack with shelves of donated books, most in English. A few titles in German. One shelf in Japanese. He found a thin paperback with faded edges. Democracy in America, translated decades earlier. He didn't open it. A voice behind him, calm, American, asked, "Looking for something lighter?" Nakamura turned. A civilian, late 40s, wireframe glasses, soft voice. "I'm from Amarillo," the man said. "Volunteer teacher. Name's Tom." Nakamura narrowed his eyes. Tom smiled. "I've got Twain, or Hemingway, or Emerson. Ever read Self-Reliance?" No answer. Tom didn't push, just nodded, handed him a folded list of English-Japanese vocabulary cards, and walked away. Nakamura shoved them in his pocket. He never returned them. The next day, work resumed. The mud had hardened. The detail was sent to a new ranch, larger, more modern, with concrete feed bins and tractors that looked freshly painted. As Nakamura hauled sacks of grain, he noticed a boy, no older than 12, sketching on a clipboard. The boy's father called out, "Show him, Ben." The child walked up and shyly handed Nakamura the paper. It was a hand-drawn engine, labeled in pencil. P-51 Mustang, air-cooled radiator design. Nakamura froze. That engine had shot down dozens of Zeros. He'd seen them streaking across Saipan, fast, invincible. And here, it was being drawn by a child in cowboy boots. Ben tilted his head. "Do y'all have airplanes in Japan?" Nakamura looked at the boy, the sky, the drawing. "We did," he said quietly. "They were beautiful." On the drive back, Nakamura said nothing, but inside, something twisted. The Americans weren't just feeding children, they were teaching them thrust mechanics. That night, the generator failed. For 15 minutes, the lights flickered and died across the compound. Men muttered. Some cursed. But from somewhere in the dark, an American guard shouted, "Hang tight! We'll reroute the line." 5 minutes later, a backup kicked in. Lights returned, radios restarted, Dinner resumed. Nakamura blinked. Even their outages were temporary. Back in his bunk, he stared at the ceiling. He remembered the final weeks in Saipan, power failures that lasted days, radios silenced by lack of batteries, engineers begging for fuses that never came. And here, a prison in the desert ran smoother than their airfields. What kind of country builds like this? What kind of war doesn't pause? In the bunk across from him, a German whispered in the dark. "They didn't beat us with courage," he said. "They beat us with connectors." It was delivery day. The gates opened just after sunrise, and a convoy rolled in. 4 trucks, maybe 5. Nakamura watched from the barrack stoop, a tin cup of barley tea in his hand. The engines were low and steady. Tires hummed over gravel. Dust rose, settled, then rose again. There was no rush, no shouting, only process. Each truck backed into the camp yard with mechanical precision. A team of American soldiers, none older than 25, began unloading crates. Nakamura counted: fruit, bread, fresh eggs, canned milk, blocks of ice wrapped in burlap, and newspapers still warm from the press. Every item was sorted by section. Each barrack had a crate with names labeled in neat black marker. By midday, Nakamura's section received their delivery. His name, written clean in Roman letters, H. Nakamura. Inside, apples, matches, powdered soap, a fresh towel, and, at the bottom, another can of Coca-Cola. Cold. He didn't drink it. He just stared at it, sweating in the Texas heat. Nearby, a corporal from the quartermaster's staff sat cross-legged, scribbling in a supply ledger. Nakamura walked over. The man looked up, young, cheerful, not armed. Nakamura pointed to the crates. "Every week?" he asked, broken English thick on his tongue. The corporal smiled. "Every 3rd day, on the clock." Then, as if offering a secret, he said, "Even when the weather's bad." Nakamura said nothing, just turned and walked away. But the can was still in his hand. Later that afternoon, he sat beneath the mess hall awning and cracked it open. The hiss, sharp and clean. He took one sip. It was the same taste as before. But now, it felt like something else. It felt like the war had turned its back on him. He remembered the last base he'd served on. Engines disassembled for parts, pilots using rice paper for maps, running out of quinine and salt. One shipment lost to bombing. Another never arrived. They had no cold, no fruit, no fuel. And here, they iced drinks for prisoners. That night, he opened his notebook. First time in weeks. They refrigerate produce in the desert. Deliver ice like it's nothing. We carried dead pilots in sugar carts. This isn't America. This is something older than empire. It doesn't need war. It just keeps moving. He closed the notebook. Somewhere nearby, the guard tower radio played music again. Guitars, voices, that same lazy cowboy rhythm. But now, it didn't sound foolish. It sounded inevitable. The Hereford Library expanded again. They added a radio, new books, a section labeled Military Science. The Americans didn't hide anything. They wanted the prisoners to read, to see. Nakamura stepped inside during a break-in work detail. The air was cool, smelled of paper, pine soap, and dust. On the central table sat an issue of Stars and Stripes. He picked it up. The headline read, "Red Ball Express, now moving 12,000 tons daily to front lines." 12,000 tons, every day. The article described a fleet of trucks, thousands strong, racing day and night, from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Europe. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, all on schedule. One American commander was quoted saying, "We lose trucks to mud. We just send more." Nakamura sat down. The page trembled in his hand. He remembered Guadalcanal, the final push. Japanese forces clawing for fuel, eating raw coconut, burying empty shells to reuse brass. Now this, 12,000 tons, daily. He turned the page. A map. Supply routes drawn like arteries across continents. From factories in Detroit to docks in New York. From cattle ranches in Kansas to frontline stew pots in France. He didn't understand every word, but the shape of it was clear. This wasn't a war machine. It was a body. And every truck, every crate, was a red blood cell. The camp's projection room screened films twice a week. Mostly propaganda, sometimes silent reels. But on that Friday, the reel jammed. While the guards fixed it, Nakamura wandered behind the curtains. Stacked in metal boxes were instructional reels, labeled with stencils. Ford Assembly Line, 1942. B-24 Wing Integration, Consolidated Plant, Texas Pipeline Overview. He peeked through one. A conveyor belt of engines. Men moving with rhythm, no wasted motion. One every hour. Each part interchangeable. It stunned him. Not the machines, but the simplicity. Japan's factories, the few left unbombed, were artisanal. Each zero hand-finished, tuned by specialists. Lose one craftsman, lose production. But these Americans, they didn't care who assembled it. Anyone could. That was the horror. The guard called out, "Film's rolling!" Nakamura slipped back into his seat. On the screen, a bomber taxiing on a runway, sunlight flashing off its wings. In the background, crates marked "Property of U.S. Army." He whispered to himself, "They build for loss." Back in the barracks, he opened his journal again. "We worship perfection. They worship replacement. We designed for eternity. They designed for Monday morning." Across the room, a German POW named Muller was writing too. He looked up. "You saw the truck article?" Muller asked. Nakamura nodded. Muller snorted. "When I read it, I wanted to vomit." He paused. "Then I realized that's why we lost." Nakamura didn't respond, but deep down he agreed. It wasn't just trucks. It was vision. Autumn crawled into Hereford on soft soles. No dramatic storm front, no thunderclap of leaves. Just cooler mornings, paler skies, the kind of stillness that made every sound feel personal. By mid-October, even the wind sounded tired. Nakamura no longer joked. He rarely spoke at all. His days moved with the same rhythm as the supply trucks, steady, mechanical, impossible to ignore. He noticed things more now, small things. The way American guards rotated every 6 hours, exactly. The way new light bulbs appeared before old ones burned out. The way a single cough in the infirmary meant fresh linen by noon. And always, deliveries. On a Tuesday morning, 5 trucks entered the compound in perfect sequence. Same model, same crates, same chalk marks on the tires. As the unloading began, Nakamura stood under the eaves of Barrack 14C, arms crossed, watching. They weren't just unloading goods, they were performing. Each box labeled by destination, weight, category. Ice arrived in canvas sacks, newspapers tied with twine, eggs packed in sawdust. The guards didn't yell, they didn't rush, they didn't have to. That afternoon, a new visitor arrived. Captain Junji Ueno, formerly of the Imperial General Staff, now liaison officer for POW transitions. He gathered the senior officers, Japanese and German, into the camp's chapel. The cross above the altar was draped with neutral canvas, but the pews were polished. The light through the windows fell like stained glass on bare wood. Ueno stood in front, hands behind his back. "I've seen 10 camps," he began, "from Georgia to Idaho." His voice was even. No pride, no anger. In each one, the same thing. He paused. "They don't fight with bravery. They fight with replacement parts." The room held its breath. They move fuel like water, food like oxygen, troops like limbs. And every time they lose something, they don't grieve. They replace it. He unfolded a paper, held it high. The Texas Inland Pipeline, 3,500 miles, completed in under a year, runs from Houston to Pennsylvania. Unbombable, undetectable, invisible blood through the heart of war. He looked at Nakamura. "We were defeated," he said quietly, "before we ever left the runway." The room didn't applaud, didn't move. It absorbed. Nakamura left without a word. The chapel door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed louder than any sermon. That evening, he volunteered for inventory duty, something he had never done before. He walked between shelves of tools, boots, medicines, tent pegs, tire patches, shaving kits. Then he saw it. A steel crate. Label, portable field kitchen, complete. Inside, stainless burners, folding ladles, vacuum-sealed flour, tubes of grease, dried vegetables, a small tin of powdered eggs, and a roll of printed instructions in 3 languages. Stamped on the bottom, "Property of U.S. Army, made in Detroit." He touched the ladle. It still held a factory sheen. He stared at the kit for a long time, not for its weapons, but for its care. This wasn't improvisation. This was intention. Later, at the barracks, he sat by the window. The sky was black velvet. One radio crackled faintly in the guard tower. Some cowboy song, half lost in static. He remembered the boy's drawing, the P-51 engine with perfect pencil strokes. He remembered the can of Coca-Cola. He remembered the officer's words. "They don't grieve, they replace." Across the barracks, Muller, the German engineer, was relacing his boots. Quietly, he said, "We built to impress. They built to endure." Nakamura didn't reply, but his hand drifted to the pocket of his coat, where he still kept the Coca-Cola label, wrinkled now, faded, but intact. In late October, a heat wave struck Hereford. The air turned heavy, almost metallic. Dust clung to everything. But the systems, the American systems, did not flinch. Nakamura's work assignment shifted again. He was now inside the camp's central supply depot, a converted airplane hangar packed wall-to-wall with crates, shelving, and clipboards. His job was simple: inventory management. But what he saw wasn't simple. He had imagined Allied logistics as messy, piles of random goods, men improvising like stagehands. Instead, he found barcodes, index cards, color-coded tags. Every box had a twin, a destination, and a replacement date, sometimes 3 weeks ahead. One morning, a shipment arrived marked "Maintenance, Standard Issue, Small Engine Parts." Inside were replacement components for portable generators, belts, valves, spark plugs. Not one out of place. What stunned him wasn't what the Americans had. It was what they planned to lose and replace before it broke. No waiting for disaster, no reaction, just readiness. He sat on a crate during his break, sipping boiled water from a GI-issued thermos. Across the warehouse, 2 American logisticians were arguing over grease quantities. One slapped a schematic against the wall. "I don't care if it worked last week. The red ball trucks are running 24/7. You don't gamble with torque." Torque. In Japan, he'd watched Zeros grounded for weeks, over a missing bolt. Here, trucks ran full speed across continents because of a grease formula. Back in the barracks, he couldn't sleep. So he wandered. Near the fence, he found a German POW sitting on a pile of gravel, sketching a gear system. The man's name was Klaus, a former machinist from Leipzig. "They told us we were precise," Klaus muttered, "but this is elegant." He handed Nakamura a piece of paper. On it, a hand-drawn diagram of the Red Ball Express logistics chain. At the bottom, 12,000 tons per day. "They planned for terrain, for fuel, for human error," Klaus said. "They have spares for spares." Nakamura folded the paper and slipped it into his shirt. The next day, a shipment arrived late, by 20 minutes. Everyone noticed. Apologies were issued. Reports filed. Then, 5 minutes later, a backup truck arrived from a secondary route, with the same cargo. Nakamura blinked. They had layered the delivery. Later that week, the camp's water filtration unit was swapped out. Not because it failed, but because it had passed 3,000 hours of use. A form was filed, a new unit installed. The old one stored for parts. He stood near the fence that evening, staring at the water tower. It looked the same as always. But now he saw what lay behind it. Pump schedules, pressure gauges, pipe redundancy, backups for backups. He thought of Japan's engines, powered by hope and patched tubing. He remembered using a silk scarf to plug a leak in a Zero cockpit. That night, in his notebook, he wrote just one line. "They win because nothing breaks alone." The woman at the gate wore no uniform, no gun, no helmet, just a wide-brimmed hat, a pressed blouse, and a clipboard tucked under one arm. She walked through Camp Hereford like she belonged, and in a way, she did. Her name was Clara Hensley, 45, a schoolteacher from Amarillo. Every Tuesday, she volunteered in the POW education program, offering conversational English to anyone willing to sit for an hour and listen. When Nakamura entered the wrecked barrack that morning, she was already writing on the chalkboard. 3 words in neat cursive: respect, freedom, routine. He paused. She turned, smiled, and said, "You don't have to talk, just listen." He sat near the back, quiet, watching. She started with idioms, explained that routine meant more than schedule. It meant stability, a way to live, not just survive. Someone raised a hand, a German with a strong accent, and asked, "Why teach us?" "We're prisoners." She answered without hesitation, "Because you're men, and men deserve dignity, even when their countries forget." Nakamura didn't look up, but something in him shifted. The next week, he returned, sat closer. This time she brought a poem, Emerson's The American Scholar. She read it slowly, her voice soft but clear. "Man is not a farmer, or a professor, or an engineer, but he is all." After class, Nakamura approached her. "Why, teach poetry in war?" he asked, his English cautious. She didn't laugh. "Because war ends," she said, "and what's left is how we treated each other." That night, he lay awake thinking of Saipan, how prisoners there were starved, humiliated, erased, how mercy was seen as weakness. But here, Americans handed out books and listened to questions. Days later, he joined a small class on civics. The topic, checks and balances. The concept was alien. Voting to restrain your own leaders? Letting courts overrule generals? The teacher, a young sergeant with thick glasses, explained, "It's messy, but it works, because we trust process more than men." Nakamura raised his hand. "And if the process fails?" The sergeant nodded. "Then we fix it, together." No punishment, no rebuke, just trust. He thought of Japan, where command was divine, questions were disgrace, and failure meant shame or death. In Hereford, failure meant revision. In Japan, leadership flowed downward like a sword. Here, it flowed sideways, like irrigation. That weekend, Nakamura passed the camp library and noticed a poster. The war will end. But who will you be when it does? It wasn't propaganda. It was invitation. He entered, picked up self-reliance again, and read one line that stayed with him. Nothing can bring you peace but yourself. Nothing can bring you peace but the triumph of principles. Later that week, he saw Clara leaving through the main gate. Before she stepped through, she turned and waved at him. Not a goodbye, a gesture of sameness. And for the first time since capture, Nakamura raised his hand and waved back. By April 1945, Camp Hereford no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a warehouse, for people, for memory, for defeat. The guards still called roll. The kitchen still boiled beans. The American flag still waved in that hot Texas wind. But deep inside, every prisoner felt the pressure shift. It wasn't from news. It was from the silence. Germany had crumbled into maps and fires. Mussolini was already hanging. Japan was holding, but barely. Most of the Japanese officers in Hereford still held their heads high. But they had stopped talking about the emperor's unbreakable will. Nakamura had stopped praying. Instead, he read. Every morning he walked to the library and opened the same document. Quartermaster General Report, Final War Year. It was thick, gray, stamped, and terrifying. Aircraft produced, 303,000 trucks shipped, over 2.3 million combat boots manufactured, 600,000 pairs per month, artillery shells fired, 47 billion cans of food distributed, 4.5 billion, he kept turning. Pipeline mileage in Europe, 3,100 miles. Red Ball Express, 6,000 trucks, 23,000 drivers, 412,000 tons. In 82 days, he stopped. 12,000 tons a day. Not in Tokyo, not in Texas, in Normandy. He wrote in his notebook, "They didn't fight like us. They supplied like no one ever had." Outside, the camp moved with the calm of a machine after the job is done. Forklifts carried boxes. Crates were stacked and labeled with code numbers and destinations Nakamura could not read, but understood perfectly. He passed a truck unloading items marked dental kits, replacements. Behind it, another carried standard POW hygiene, one toothbrush, one soap, one comb, one pack playing cards. Inside the mess hall, a new poster appeared. Repatriation kits begin May 1st, includes one translated manual, Life After War. Clarity arrived not like a bullet, but like a label. He stood at the edge of the yard and watched Mueller, the machinist from Leipzig, stare at the boxes too. Mueller didn't drink coffee anymore. He only whispered strange, bitter truths. "They send razors to men who surrendered," he muttered. "We sent medals to men we lost." Nakamura sat beside him. "They're preparing us," Nakamura said, "as if we were not broken." "They never intended to break us," Mueller replied. "Just replace us." That night, Nakamura skipped dinner and returned to the chapel. Not to pray, to write. They scaled the war. We dramatized it. They didn't fear attrition. They budgeted for it. He stared at those words. For the first time, they didn't sting. They explained. The next morning, he heard a sound he hadn't heard in months. A train whistle, long and low across the prairie. A freight line moving east. Not troops. Not weapons. Just crates. Lots of them. He walked along the fence and watched a flatbed car roll by, carrying wooden boxes stacked 4 high. Each stamped in black ink, "Return, inventoried, ready." It wasn't the lettering that struck him. It was the rhythm. Everything was expected. Everything was counted. Everything was still part of a plan. He reached into his coat and pulled out the old Coca-Cola label he had carried since that first camp meal. It had faded, bent at the corners, but the script still curled with cheerful arrogance. He sat beneath a dry tree and wrote beneath it, "We glorified sacrifice. They glorified preservation. We sent warriors. They sent warranty." He looked toward the sun, still sharp above the desert. Nothing about the land had changed, but everything beneath it had. He heard an American guard say, "Looks like we're ahead of schedule." And Nakamura smiled. It wasn't bitterness. It was recognition. They had not beaten him in spirit. They had not broken him in will. They had simply moved past him, not with tanks, not with fire, but with systems and time. Years later, Nakamura returned, not as a prisoner, but as a tourist. Texas had changed, or maybe it had always been this way, and he had only now learned to see it. He stood beside the foundation of what used to be Barrack 12. There was no fence, no tower, just dry grass, a rusted hinge, and a worn-out plaque. Site of the Hereford World War II POW camp, 1943 to 1946. He bent down and touched the dirt. Still dry, still stubborn, still America. A rancher's son, older now, walked by with his own boy. The child wore cowboy boots too large for his legs and held a red bottle with white script. Nakamura smiled. Still Coca-Cola. Still here. He sat on a bench and opened his old journal. The label was still tucked inside, brittle now, but legible. He remembered the feeling, that first sip, not sweet, not cold, but structured. A formula, not a flavor. It wasn't about taste. It was about promise. Behind him, a pickup truck rolled by. 2 workers in uniform were unloading boxes behind a supermarket. Labels everywhere, schedules on clipboards, stickers marked Logistics Hub, Zone 4. And just like that, he understood. America had never really won the war. It had outlasted it. It had outpaced it. It had outprocessed it. It built something no one else saw coming. A country made of procedure. He closed the journal. He stood. And for a brief second, he felt grateful. Not that they had spared him, but that they had shown him what was coming.